All right, thanks, Tim, for the introduction. And yeah, I'm going to talk about our watershed scale restoration experiment in Hood Canal this morning. I want to start by acknowledging my co-authors, in particular Kurt Kruger with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who leads the habitat monitoring, and Clayton Kinsel with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who leads our fish monitoring. So what I'm going to do today is try to provide a brief overview of the study as a whole. We've got 4 different watersheds, part of this complex of streams in Hood Canal. But I'm really going to focus our results on Little Anderson Creek, because simply given the timeline of restoration, this is the study stream that we have the best perspective on a fish and habitat response to restoration. So just a quick map showing you where we're located here. So we're in western Washington on Hood Canal in the Puget Sound region. So Hood Canal is a long, narrow glacial fjord, saltwater. So each of these 4 creeks, so Stavis, Seebeck, Big Beef, and Little Anderson, are independent streams that flow into Hood Canal. And then just some sort of broad key attributes of this IMW, just to help you put it into context with some of the other streams and studies you're going to hear about today. So these 4 streams are low elevation, Puget lowland sort of landscape streams. The hydrograph is dominated by rain, see about 100 centimeters or so of rain a year. The land use is primarily rural residential. Most of these watersheds are forested, and there's a legacy of industrial scale logging beginning in the 1870s, in which these watersheds were pretty cleaned out in terms of the timber. So I would say the 2 primary habitat impacts here are that legacy of logging, as well as the sort of rural residential development that's expanding. In this case, the town of Silverdale expanding into some of these watersheds. But I would say our study streams are broadly characteristic of a lot of the small streams that in aggregate hold a wealth of coho and steelhead habitat in western Washington and western Oregon. Now our primary study species for this, the IMW here, is coho salmon. So the freshwater rearing phase gives us that extended look at the manner in which the freshwater habitat is functioning. So we estimate abundance at 3 distinct life stages. I'll talk a little bit more about that as the talk progresses. Not going to talk too much about harvest, but there is a pretty significant amount of harvest on these populations. So we have an index stream in Big Beef Creek, where we've got a wild coded tag group. And during the course of the study, we're estimating harvest at around 70%. It ranges from about 30% to, in some years, up to 85%. And we also see cutthroat, steelhead, chum salmon in 1 or more of these study streams, but because of their limited distribution and or inability to estimate abundance at multiple life stages, we're really focusing on coho salmon. So, one of the consequences of this legacy of logging and the road crossings that are pervasive throughout this area with the human development is we've got this real dramatic imbalance in the sediment dynamics of the systems, where we have alternating reaches of real severe incision. In a lot of these cases, I can walk down the stream with my arms outstretched, sort of a mini canyon touching the stream on both sides. You can see roots of the trees and other vegetation sort of hanging out of those almost cliff faces. Oftentimes, these are immediately downstream of culverts that are undersized. And that is sort of alternated with these regions of real extreme deposition, where you've got just piles and piles of sediment. You can see here, in some cases, these trees were not initially rooted in the sediment, but have become buried by all this gravel coming downstream. A lot of times, not always, these sediment deposition zones are immediately upstream of culverts that are essentially disconnecting the longitudinal connectivity of the stream. So in terms of our restoration, just going to walk through a timeline here. So Little Anderson Creek, again, this is the creek on which I'm going to focus the results portion of the presentation. It's seen the most significant restoration. So a culvert that was blocking was opened up in 2002. And there's been a series of large woody debris projects. I'm going to point your attention to the 2 that occurred in 2009 and then again in 2016. These are the most significant in terms of the extent of stream treated, the size of the logs, the orientation of those logs into engineered log jams. Sort of differs in the extent of the smaller pieces that were added in 2007 and in 2015. So in Big Beef Creek, there's been a real recent flurry of activity in restoration in sort of 2014 through 2016. So 3 large woody debris projects that occurred in sequence, and then a pretty significant floodplain reconnection project. So the lower portion of the watershed, a dike forming road was removed. The channel immediately evolved, reconnected to about 5 hectares of wetland that looks like really high quality overwintering habitat for coho salmon. In Seabed Creek, we've had a number of culverts replaced. In most cases, these are sort of at the periphery of the watershed, sort of out of the Acknowledgement zone, or in fact, were actually road infrastructure maintenance projects. So a small undersized culvert was replaced with a larger box culvert, but not necessarily designed for passing sediment or woody debris in terms of a larger spanning bridge. Really was replacing a road that had washed out in a storm. So kind of hard to sort of pin our hopes for detecting a response to the Seabed restoration. And then lastly, Stavis Creek has served as our reference. So again, when I get to the results portion of the talk, really going to focus my attention on Little Anderson Creek. So in terms of the monitoring, again, 3 distinct life stages of coho salmon. So smolts we monitor via channel spanning weirs down near the mouth of the creek, so we get a full census count of smolt production. This data set actually goes back to 1990 and was one of the reasons these streams were chosen as an IMW study 10 or more years ago. We count adults via red surveys throughout the known spawning distributions, weekly surveys. And then we have a summer Parr abundance estimate based on a market capture approach. We go out to 10 sites in each watershed at the end of July and early August, mark roughly 1,000 fish per stream. The proportion that are recaptured the following spring in the full traps gives us an estimate of summer Parr abundance. And then lastly, we have habitat data beginning in 2007. Our methods are identical to what Mara described in her presentation of Lower Columbia IMW habitat data. So 25 or more sites per watershed, spatially balanced design, a whole host of metrics. I'm only going to talk about a couple of them today. So in terms of the research questions I'm going to try to address today, first, what was the habitat response to large woody debris addition in Little Anderson Creek? So we're going to talk about large woody debris counts and pool frequency. What was the fish response to culvert replacement and large woody debris addition in Little Anderson Creek? So 3 metrics: smolt abundance, Parr abundance, and Parr to smolt survival. And then lastly, I'm going to look at density dependence, both in terms of productivity and survival, as well as growth and body size, because I think these results help us put the findings into context. All right, so just a little more detailed map of Little Anderson Creek here. So the culvert that I mentioned that was removed in 2002 is right down here, only about 1 kilometer or so below that replacement. And then we've got the large woody debris treatment, so the most significant of which were occurring, both of which in this roughly 2 kilometer reach upstream, so in 2009 and 2016. So white circles here represent all the habitat monitoring sites. The squares represent our Parr monitoring sites. There is a road here not shown on the map, roughly just upstream of that upper large woody debris treatment that is a fish and sediment and woody debris barrier across all of these tributaries. So just a few photographs to demonstrate the restoration actions themselves. Now, I don't have a lot of photographs or even that much information on the culvert replacement. It occurred about 10 years before I started working for the Department of Fish and Wildlife and became involved with this project. From what I've been able to piece together, reading through reports, it was undersized. It periodically became entirely plugged with sediment and debris and was essentially a full passage barrier. It would get cleared out through natural events, also sort of through road maintenance. And so at times it passed fish, but for often in the winter periods, it was entirely choked with debris. These are some pictures I took just this past spring of the bridge sprint, the current bridge span. So interestingly enough, over this past winter, beaver activity created a whole wetland complex essentially immediately under this bridge that replaced that undersized culvert. The point here being that the bridge span is large enough that we're sort of promoting natural ecological stream processes in place of a severe choke point in terms of connectivity to the stream. So here are 2 pictures of the large woody debris placement, just trying to show you the size, the scope, the scale of the treatment. You can see the cut logs here obviously being placed. So then just before I dive into the results portion, just back to the timeline here. So I'm going to start with the habitat data. Just given the timeline, we really only have a good perspective on these more recent large woody debris projects. With the culvert project, I'm only going to be presenting Smolt data, just given the timeline. And with the Parr data, we can look at only these large woody debris projects. All right, so here's the first results slide. So again, time on the x-axis, large woody debris per 100 meters on the y-axis. Our metric here is essentially our largest size class, so pieces that are larger than 6 meters diameter and 5 meters long. So the 4 sites that we have in that treatment reach, that upper treatment reach, are shown with these white box plots, the gray box plots. The light gray is a reference within Little Anderson Creek itself, so all the sites outside of those treatment reaches. And then Stavis shown in the dark gray, which is the entire watershed that's serving as our reference. The timing of the debris treatments relative to the surveys are shown with these dashed lines. And what you can see is there's not really a dramatic increase in woody debris. Perhaps this year, immediately after the second treatment, you see a bit of a jump up. But if anything, it's more of a gradual increase and not really a punctuated increase. So when I did a trend analysis, so a pretty simple multiple regression model, I've got a reference metric from Anderson Creek as a covariate, and then time essentially as a year order variable. There is a positive relationship between the treatment and reference, so we're seeing correlation between the reference and the treatment site. There is a very subtle increasing trend in the median of these 4 treatment sites over time. And of the 4 treatment sites, 2 of them are showing an increasing trend and 2 of them are not. Okay, so the second metric here is pool frequency. So similar to what Mara was showing with the percent gravel, we see a lot of interannual variation in pool frequency over time. But there's not really a trend towards increasing pool frequency in the treatment reaches. And in fact, the trend analysis, so we have a strong relationship between treatment and reference. The trend analysis is actually showing that within the treatment sites, there's a slight negative trend in pool frequency. And that is shown in 2 of the 4 sites within that treatment reach. So pretty slight negative. We're only talking 2 to 3% per year. But because of the amount of variation from year to year, we're not really able to detect any kind of a treatment effect signal that one would hypothesize increasing pools in response to the placement of woody debris. In terms of smolt abundance, I'm just showing the time series here. On the x-axis, total number of smolt on the y-axis. So Little Anderson in dark black. The gray is the reference Stavis. This is our culvert replacement. This is our 2 significant large woody debris placements. So you can see that there was a significant jump in average smolt production after that culvert replacement. So it more than tripled from just under 300 smolts to more than 900 smolts after that replacement. And if we plot these data slightly differently, we see another real sort of interesting trend. So I plotted the reference Davis Creek on the x-axis, the treatment Little Anderson Creek on the y-axis, and the different symbols refer to the different time periods of the study. So we can see that these triangles, which represent the time period before that culvert was replaced, we're essentially seeing no correlation between the Little Anderson and Stavis. It sort of looks like that culvert, that barrier, was sort of decoupling the Little Anderson population dynamics from whatever was occurring in Stavis. After the culvert was replaced, we see a really strong relationship between Stavis and Little Anderson. So these filled-in circles are after the culvert, but before the large woody debris occurred in 2009. And then the open circles and the dashed line are the more recent period after both the culvert and the large woody debris placement project. So we see a slight but non-significant difference according to the large woody debris placement. So about 350 smolts greater after the large woody debris placement, but again, the result is non-significant. Here, however, I think the real key result is just that decoupling of the population dynamic processes between the treatment and reference prior to that culvert replacement. So in Parr abundance, Stavis and Little Anderson, same plot I was showing for smolts again with the 95% confidence intervals. Again, these streams are tracking each other really closely. When I plot the reference versus the treatment, we're seeing a really strong correlation between the two, but really no treatment effect in terms of Parr abundance. Same with Parr to Smolt survival. Treatment and reference tracking each other really closely, except for this one outlier year, sort of a low abundance year in Little Anderson that we think probably has a significant amount of observation error. But again, plotting the reference versus the treatment, we're seeing real strong correlation, but essentially no treatment effect. So lastly, in terms of density dependence, I simply try to fit a very simple Ricker stock recruit curve. So we've got reds on the x-axis, Smolt on the y-axis for treatment and reference. And whether or not this red term is significant tells me whether or not that density dependent curve is fitting better than a simple sort of density independent linear model. So no significance here in Little Anderson, so no real strong evidence of density dependent productivity at the watershed scale. In Stavis, we do have this curve fitting based on the p-value here, that red predictor, but most of the years our adult abundance is down here on the linear portion of the stock recruit curve. So we're sort of in that density independent phase. So this is telling me that rarely are we seeing density dependent constraints on productivity at the watershed scale. That doesn't mean density dependence isn't happening locally. So I also looked at growth. So again, treatment and reference on the left and right respectively. Parr abundance on the x-axis, average fork length on the y-axis. A real strong trend in both systems whereby we're seeing smaller fish and higher abundance years. Unfortunately, the timing of the abundance data are confounded with the treatment. It'd be really nice to see if that large body debris treatment somehow alleviated density dependent growth. Unfortunately, most of the years after the treatment are occurring in this low abundance phase. We sort of got some confounding variables there in terms of piecing out whether or not there was a growth benefit afforded by this large body debris treatment. Okay, just a couple slides to wrap up here. In terms of the summary of the results, what was the habitat response to large woody debris addition in Little Anderson Creek? So generally, we saw moderate to strong correlations between treatment and reference. We saw a slight gradual increase in the largest size class of our woody debris and a slight decrease, sort of going against our hypothesis here, in pool frequency. In terms of a fish response, the culvert replacement and large woody debris addition, Smolt abundance tripled following the replacement of that culvert with a channel spanning bridge. We saw a slight non-significant increase in Smolt abundance following the large woody debris addition. We saw no change in Parr abundance following the large woody debris addition. And we saw no change in Parr to Smolt survival following large woody debris addition. And then lastly, in terms of density dependence, in most years, both a treatment and a reference appear to be below population scale density dependence thresholds, but we are seeing pretty strong evidence for density dependent growth. So lastly, just our lessons learned here, sort of the take-home messages as I would describe them. So in terms of habitat, we've seen a significant amount of natural variation in habitat, meaning we have many years and there are large magnitude restoration actions that are going to be needed to detect the treatment effect. And we're seeing these treatment and reference schemes respond at multiple scales, so watershed, reach, site scales appear to be responding to similar natural processes. In terms of restoration techniques and prioritization, maybe not necessarily earth-shattering news here, but we saw the most significant response to a connectivity project that allowed the stream and the fish to sort of reconnect to the upper portion of Little Anderson Creek. So these connectivity projects really seem like they need to have the highest priority when it comes to stream restoration. And I also argue that connectivity is not just about fish passage. When we look at this imbalance in the sediment dynamics, it really appears that these culverts are barriers to the movement of sediment and woody debris as well. And then lastly, our working hypothesis here is that the fish response to restoration is likely to be most pronounced in those situations where a treatment alleviates density dependence constraints on productivity. And in our case, just at the adult abundance, we're not at that point where we're typically seeing full seeding, watershed scale density dependent productivity. Lastly, a whole host of folks to thank here. This has really been a team effort across the board. Agencies responsible for funding, the teams on the ground, and all my colleagues for their thoughts and comments on the work itself. Thank you.